People's rights are all the same, and their rights are not founded on papers or documents or constitutions or politicians or citizenship. And if you don't respect everyone's rights equally, you're a fascist. Property rights, because I've seen a lot of misconceptions lately, and I hear people using property rights as arguments, right, for everything from socialism to illegal and unconstitutional immigration restrictions. And so I thought, let's get down to the nuts and bolts a little bit on property rights and kind of nail down what's really going on. Property rights are a fundamental human right. They're not a constitutional right. The Constitution doesn't give you property rights. You already have property rights, all right? Constitution protects property rights. We know the Fourth Amendment and the Constitution and the right of the people to be secure in their persons, papers, and properties, and no warrant shall issue but on probable cause, and the right to due process, and the Fifth and Sixth Amendments, right? And so we know we have property rights and they're supposed to be protected, but then again, we have courts in the United States that universally disregard the Constitution. We have police that universally disregard the Constitution. We have politicians that universally disregard the Constitution, and we have leaders all the way up to the highest levels in government that are literally waging war on our rights and pretending it's freedom and feeding the sheep the propaganda of the global elite on everything from terror to immigration to restrictions to abusing others. Property rights are a given in the Constitution because when the founders drew up our Constitution, the rights of human beings were a given. We hold these truths to be self-evident. So where do the property rights come from? Well, property rights are inherent. Property rights are natural law. Property rights go back to the foundation of law, and that foundation is life, liberty, and property. You hear me talking about this a lot, particularly when I deal with legal matters. And these are global, these are universal human rights, and you don't need a constitution for your human rights. You go back in history, even to the foundations of Blackstone and way before the USA, there was this principle of even the pauper at his front door has a line that the king cannot cross. We have a right to life, and essentially all the other rights extend out. So to have life, you have to have property, you have to have food, you have to have a shelter over your head to sustain that life, and to do that, you have to have liberty, freedom of travel. This is a foundation that you don't need an argument for, you don't need a law for, because if anyone agrees that they have a right to their life, then they agree that they have a right to their liberty and their property. No politician or pontificating bureaucrat needs to define that for us. Okay, we have life, liberty, and property, but what makes it? What makes it property? What makes this property? If I rent a place, right, what makes that my property during the period that I'm renting? If I have a car, what makes that my property? If you don't play their way, they'll come with guns to your head and they'll take your stuff. They'll take your property. But why is it your property? It's your property. Here's why. Because it's taken out of nature. Now, one argument I see that's completely erroneous when I talk about how bogus our immigration stuff is. And I see people saying, oh, well, don't you respect private property? Like, they can't come into our country. And I'm like, are you serious right now? Your entire country is not your private property. Property is not something that you just get to point. Okay, a national boundary. Let's not get too deep into the borders thing, but let's say, okay, we can have a national boundary, and that boundary represents the sovereignty of our states and our union, and our militias protect that and make sure we're not invaded by a foreign army. It doesn't mean they can stop anybody from traveling. That would be a violation of individual right to travel as well as property rights and detainment rights. That would be kidnapping if without probable cause of a crime, you stopped someone and searched them and arrested them, like is happening at borders every day. You don't get to point at that country and say, that's my property. We got together, me and a bunch of my buddies, we got together and we formed a nation, and we're just pointing at all that land and saying it's our property. That's actually what the federal government did when they stole our forests from us for the national forest. They went through on a train and they pointed at the hills and they said, oh, this is all federal land now, we're in control of it. And the people tolerated it. That was the problem, and that's how tyranny grows, is when we allow that kind of abuse. So you don't get to drive by an empty piece of land, right, and say, that's my property because I claimed it. like you did of the front seat when you were a kid. What makes something your property is when you take it out of nature. The land is for beneficial use, all right? We have a right to life, liberty, and property, and open land we have a right to use. It doesn't matter if you have papers or if you're a citizen or a non-citizen. Open land that is unclaimed and not taken out of nature is available for beneficial use unless it's somehow been taken out of nature. So you could say, well, we can have a state park so we can have a nice, pretty area to play in. And we've taken this out of nature, we've sectioned it off, we've put roads in it, we've fenced it in, right? And this is for the benefit of the community. Sure, that's a reasonable argument. You can have public lands for beneficial use, but you can't just take 3 billion acres of mountain and say, oh, we own this, or oh, the government owns this now, nobody can use it. Nor can you point at 3 trillion acres of countryside and say, oh, this is our country now, it's all private property, nobody can enter, and if they do, it's our private property and we get to violate their rights. That's a BS argument, you guys. Property comes from the individual when they take something out of nature. So why is your home your property? Well, your home could be your property because you homesteaded or squatted on it, right? Maybe you built a farm on it. It used to be common in the U.S. where people would homestead or squat on a piece of open land, and they would take it out of nature, and it would eventually become theirs. In Mexico, that's actually still very common to do that. It becomes your property because you've taken it out of nature. Now, if in the meantime somebody that has a deed to the property comes and they say, well, this is my legitimate claim to the property, then you have to deal with that. Then you have to leave if they request it. The point being is that by taking something out of nature, right, if you go out and you pull a fish out of the lake, now let's not even get into the licensing and all the absurdity, right? You have a right to feed yourself. So you pull a fish out of the lake and you're walking down the road. Now that fish is your property. You pick apples off a wild apple tree and you have them in a basket. Why are they your property? Because a minute ago they were still in nature, guys. Now the thug comes up, right, with his goons and he says, hey, I'm taking half of your apples, or I'm taking all of your apples. Does he have that right? Of course not, because he didn't take them out of nature. They're not his property. Now, he could go to that wild apple tree that's still in the wild and in nature, that hasn't had a house and a fence built around it and been maintained by an individual. It's still in nature. He can go pick his own apples. But when he takes your apples that you took out of nature, it's theft. And it doesn't matter if it's government or a politician or a church or a thug with a gun or a common burglar. There's no difference. By the sweat of your brow is how you take something out of nature. So if I go to work, right, I make a product, or I work and I buy a box of apples, or I buy these glasses right here. Why are they my property? They're my property because I worked. So by my effort, I obtained some of this fake US dollars, right, that actually have no backing, but people still value them, so we trade them, right? Let's not get into the value of the currency. The fact is you worked for it, okay? So if I go and I buy a house, if I go buy a house that I didn't build, it's still my property because that house was taken out of a dirt field. The elements in that house, the floor, the fountain, the door, everything was taken out of nature by the sweat of people's labor. You don't have to be the direct person that took that particular object out of nature. You can work elsewhere and then use whatever currency or trade agreement you come to with the person who took it out of nature, and you can purchase that. And at that point, right, the person who took it out of nature, or owns it or bought it, it's their private property. It can't be infringed on. It is their castle. The government has no authority. The neighbor has no authority. The community coalition has no authority. The city council has no authority unless you are violating the rights of another. Life, liberty, and property are all our inherent rights, and your property comes from what you work to take out of nature, whether directly by actually going out to the field and picking the apples, or indirectly by going to work and making money and buying the car, the motorcycle, the house, the lumber, the glasses, the shirt. It's your property. And the moment by the sweat of your brow that you have pulled something out of nature, either directly or indirectly, it becomes your property. And so next time somebody tries to make an argument for abusing their neighbor and they say, well, it's public land, or it's our borders, we have a right to molest the immigrant, call them on it. Don't let them make up fake law. These things are defined. They didn't come from our Constitution. They're human rights that have been there since the beginning for hundreds, even thousands of years, and you'll find these same principles, and you'll also find governments and corrupt people abusing them all along the way. If people understand their rights, they can stand up. The government, the democracy, the collective does not have a right to vote away your rights, because no one has a right to have authority over something, to make a law over something that they never had the authority over in the first place. You don't have a right to your neighbor's private property. That's why you don't have a right to make a law that restricts it. And any such law is already illegal. Regardless of whether it's on the books, it's not a law, it's a false law, it's a statute that has no basis in law. You don't have a right to restrict the travel of someone, whether across a border or not across a border or on a highway, when there's no probable cause. Why? Because you don't get to just claim the entire universe as your private property and then molest everyone who treads upon it. You don't just get to make up the law. The ultimate private property starts with your person, and you have a right to defend that private property against molestation from any means necessary. See, your body is your private property, but the body of another is not. What you've taken out of nature is your private property, but what your neighbor has taken out of nature is not. And I thought, well, let's talk about private property. I hope I conveyed that in the way that I had hoped to. If you think that I touched on the points, spread this, share it, let other people know, and let's know our rights so we can protect our rights and disobey those that try to violate them.